Hi guys, it's Jess from Honest Fiction, and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I am going to be sharing my August wrap-up. Alright guys, so my reading slump is officially over. I know last month I said I read a ton of really good books. However, this month, oh my gosh, almost every single book was a 5-star, including my new favorite read of the year. So this month was just perfection. Now, when I was putting this video together, I realized I read 8 books, and I swore I read more than that, and then I realized that more than half the books I read were over 500 pages. So while I read 8 books, I did get a lot of reading done, it feels like, in August, and most of the books are fantasy romance, with 2 dark romance books I'll talk about at the end of the video. But overall, it was such a good reading month, and I'm just so happy about that. So I'm excited to talk about these books with you guys. Now, if you're unfamiliar with my channel, I post new videos every Wednesday and Sunday. If you haven't yet, please like and subscribe. You can also hit that notification bell to be notified whenever I post new bookish content. You can also check out my Instagram, Goodreads, and Patreon, all linked down below. With all that out of the way, let's talk about the books I read in August. So starting off with my Patreon book club pick for August, we have Flames of Chaos by Amelia Hutchins. So this is the first book in the Legacy of Nine Realms series, which is a dark fantasy romance series. If you are unfamiliar with this story, we are following Arya, and her along with her sisters are all very powerful Hecate witches. Now at the start of our story, Arya and her family are traveling to Haven Falls, which is a paranormal community, in order to find Arya's twin sister who has gone missing. Now when Arya and her family get to Haven Falls, they immediately encounter Nox. Now Nox is the self-appointed king of Haven Falls, and right away, Arya and Nox do not get along, and it's their romance. And I will say, I really struggled with the first 60 to 70% of this book. I actually DNF'd this book all the way back in 2019 or 2020, and I might have DNF'd it again if I didn't have to read this for Patreon. Honestly, just because of the writing. The writing, like I said, very crude. I've said this in other videos, there was a pineapple scene that I really wanted to DNF. I just could not believe what I was reading. However, I loved the romance and the angst and the enemies to lovers, and while the second half of this book did get very dark, I actually liked that element, and I'm really curious to see what is going to happen in the next book. So I will definitely be continuing with this series. I feel kind of odd recommending this book because like I said, really was not a fan of the entire beginning. However, the story ended up being really good, and I've heard so many people say that as you progress, the writing does get better. So I'm honestly excited to continue with Legacy of Nine Realms. And next up, we have Matefinder by Leia Stone. So technically this is a paranormal romance, but we are following Aurora, and at the beginning of our story, she is in a fatal car accident. Now luckily, she's actually seen by Kai, who is the head of a werewolf pack, or an alpha werewolf, and he goes and he ends up transforming Aurora in order to save her life. Now when Aurora wakes up, she finds out 3 things. 1, that supernatural creatures are actually real. 2, she is a werewolf. And 3, not only is she a werewolf, but she's actually a mate finder. So in this world, werewolves need to find their mates in order to produce young, or else werewolves are slowly going to become extinct. So mate finders are seen as being very important in the community. And then other paranormal creatures start finding out that there is a mate finder or a newly created mate finder, and they are all kind of trying to either kidnap her or unalive her or use her for their own gain, and it goes from there. Now, I will say I had really high hopes for this book. I think because I kept comparing it in my head to Sanctum, which is my favorite shifter type romance. It's by Hannah McBride. Highly recommend. This one unfortunately didn't work for me. This was my lowest rated book of the month. I do think people will enjoy it. I just, didn't know it was YA when I went into it. The tone felt a lot younger. The pacing was very fast-paced. Like, this story hooks you immediately. However, I just really wasn't that interested in the story or the characters. So, unfortunately, I will not be continuing with this series, but if you're looking for a really good werewolf romance, I highly recommend giving this a shot. And next up, we have Embers in the Snow, which is a standalone vampire fantasy romance. So if you don't want to commit to a giant series, I feel like this would be a great book to check out. In this story, we are following Finley, and she is a baron's daughter. And at the very start of her story, she is married off to the emperor's eldest son, who has actually been cursed by dark magic and lives in kind of the middle of nowhere, but she has to cross this like very treacherous winter landscape to get to her future husband. And she really doesn't know anything about him, besides the fact that he is apparently cursed and doesn't go out in sunlight. And it is their story. And I talked about this book with Jen from the Book Refuge, and she described this book as small town fantasy romance, and I completely agree. I feel like while there isn't a ton of action, and that's probably my only complaint about this book, it's just these two people that are trying to live a happy life and get by with all of these obstacles standing in their way. But there really isn't a ton of angst or anything like that. Like, they pretty much both accept this arranged marriage, like, right off the bat. And they're just trying to help each other out because they are both in, like, pretty horrible predicaments when they end up finally meeting. But overall, I really enjoyed this. And like I said, it is a standalone. So if you don't feel like reading a giant series, this is a great book to check out. And next up, we have House of Bane and Blood, which is an adult fantasy. In this story, we are following heiress Camilla, and her family has fallen on hard times. So in order to save her family's crumbling syndicate, she agrees to an arranged marriage with a rival leader named Nikolai. Well, now that these two are married, Nikolai and Camilla have to work together to try to stop a kidnapper. But while all this is going on, they're starting to have a little bit of a blossoming romance between the two, although their families both really still detest each other. So overall, this was kind of pitched as being similar to Peaky Blinders, and I think it really lived up to that. I read a few books that have said they had a Peaky Blinders type vibe, and this is the first one that they nailed it, like, completely. It also has a bit of a steampunk feel, and I did really enjoy this book. My only critique was the magic. It was a little bit confusing. I wish we kind of got a little bit more in depth with the magic system because it was really interesting, but in terms of romance, story, pacing, it was perfection. So highly recommend. This was a very unique story, and the Peaky Blinders vibes were so good. And these next two books, I think I've actually talked about in every single video since I finished them, and they are also my favorite fantasy romance books of the year so far. So I will try to keep this very brief because I'm sure you guys know what books they are. But we have Reign of Shadows and Endings, which is the first book in the Legacy series by Melissa K. Roehrich. This is a dark fantasy romance series that I absolutely adore. So if you're unfamiliar with the story, we are following Tessa. And Tessa lives in a realm where the gods created the Legacy, and the Legacy rule over the Fae. So Tessa is actually a Fae, so she is known once she comes of age, she will one day have to serve one of the 6 different Legacy houses. Well, when it is Tessa's turn to be selected and given a role, she gets selected to be the primal source to the heir of endings. Now, this is a very big deal, and Tessa was not prepared for it. Now, when you become a source, you are actually forced to take on these tattoos that connect you to the heir you're attached to. So I call it kind of like a forced mating bond. So one of the tattoos allows you to hear the heir's thoughts and they hear your thoughts. Also, you can sense each other's presence, emotion. You also have a little bit of a romance where you start to really yearn for the person that has the tattoo. So Tessa obviously is very uncomfortable with being tethered to a complete stranger, and it is her story. So I will say once again, it is a dark romance. It really plays around with the captor-captive trope, so if you are not a fan of that trope, you will not enjoy this first book. So know that going in. However, I loved this book so much. It kind of reminded me of Enslaved by Gianna Darling, but a like fantasy romance version, also a little bit of the bonds that tie. I just really loved the whole dynamic of having this bond that like you almost are reluctant about. So I loved this book. I also absolutely loved the second book. I will say the second book has a lot more action. There's also different creatures. And overall, I have not loved a series this much since I first read ACOTAR. So I'm just so happy that I discovered it. Now, I will say I've had a lot of people ask, should you finish the Lady of Darkness series before you jump into the Legacy series? Originally, I said no, you definitely do not have to read Lady of Darkness. However, although I rated both books 5 stars, I feel like I would have enjoyed the second book so much more had I read the Lady of Darkness series. So With that being said, kind of go into it with your, I don't exactly know how to explain it, but it's completely up to you. I gave both books 5 stars without having read Lady of Darkness. However, I do want to go back and read Lady of Darkness and then read book 2 again to see what I missed. But overall, the series is absolutely amazing, and I hope you guys enjoy it. And next up, we have Nocticadia by Kerri Lake. I am kicking myself that it took me so long to pick this book up. This might be my new favorite Gothic book that features a student-teacher trope. I thought Gothicana was good. This is it is perfection. I love this book so much. But this story is following Leia, and at the start of her story, Leia ends up losing her mother to a mysterious illness. Now, she is just trying to get by when she gets accepted into Nocticadia University, and she wants to go there to study the pathogen that she believes possibly killed her mother. However, when she gets there, she soon meets Dr. Roehrich, and he is the school's pathologist with a very dark reputation, and it is their romance. The Gothic vibes of this story are so unbelievably good. Also, it seems like the perfect blend of horror mixed with romance, and I know that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, but the very beginning of this story is honestly super, super creepy. There is this parasite that is mentioned throughout most of this book, and I think the author did such a wonderful job of comparing how the parasite feels inside you to our main character falling in love, because it is so new to her, and the writing in this was just unbelievably good. So if you are looking for a dark, Gothic, forbidden romance, please read this book. I know it is chunky. I honestly took my time with this. It took me over a week to read, but so worth it. I loved this book so much, and I really hope the author ends up writing a sequel. And last up, I read Graves, which is a dark serial killer romance. This is actually the first book I read in August, and I had such a fun time with it. So the story is following Xaden and Dominic. They are twin brothers that have no qualms about unaliving, and Xaden becomes completely infatuated with this girl named Blake. Now, Blake has no idea any of this is going on, but Xaden actually ends up stalking Blake until he sees someone about to harm her, and then he ends up going to prison for unaliving that person. Once again, Blake has no idea any of this is happening. So when Xaden goes to prison, he asks his twin Dominic to watch over his angel, who is Blake. So then Dominic ends up also following Blake, but he actually also becomes infatuated and decides that he wants to make his presence known. So then Dominic and Blake end up in a romance, and then Xaden gets out of prison and is very upset about all of this, and that is pretty much where the story starts to get going. And like I said, I didn't take this too seriously, but it was a really fun romance. Also, serial killer twins, I mean, it was a good time. So highly recommend. I think if you liked Butcher and Blackbird and those type of books, you'll probably really end up enjoying this. All right, guys, those are all the books I read in August. Please let me know down in the comments below if you have read any of the books I mentioned or you have any book recommendations for me. And I'd like to say a huge thank you to my Paladin protectors, Amanda, Erin, Leslie, Lotta, and Kat. Thank you guys so much for supporting my channel. And I said this already, I post new videos every Wednesday and Sunday. And if you haven't yet, please like and subscribe. I will see you all next week. Bye.